The alarm hit my chest before it hit my ears. A pressure drop in Ward 6, patient monitor screaming, and I was already moving before my mind caught up with my legs. 11,000 patients had passed through my hands since I came to Meridian Station General, and not one of them had ever made my hearts race the way this one did. Every single time his numbers spiked. I am Vethik. I am Seravi, a species built for calculation, for calm, for numbers that never lie to you. My people do not run toward danger. We assess it, we weigh it, and we choose the path that saves the most lives with the least loss. That is what makes us good doctors. That is what makes us good nurses. That is what, until I came to this station, I believed made us good at anything at all. I burst through the ward doors and saw him, Daniel Whitfield. 43 years old, human, a body kept alive by machines that hummed louder than his own heart. His vitals were crashing, a cascade failure racing down every line on the monitor, and for one terrible second I thought this was it, the day the numbers finally won. Grace Holloway was already at his side, hands steady, voice sharp and clear as she called for a crash cart nobody needed to fetch because it was already there. Because someone always kept it there, right outside his door, every single day, for 8 months. I ran the calculation without meaning to. It is instinct for my kind, the way breathing is instinct for a human. A man with 11% brain activity, no meaningful recovery in 8 months, consuming resources that could save 14 other patients waiting in the lower wards. The math was simple. The math had always been simple. Let him go. Free the bed. Save the many. I did not say it. I had learned by then never to say it out loud in this hospital. But some old unspoken part of me still ran the numbers every time his heart faltered, because that is what I was built to do. And I did not yet understand why an entire hospital had spent 8 months refusing to listen to arithmetic that any coalition medical officer would call obvious. Grace worked fast. Her hands did not shake. Behind her, Oliver Finch arrived within 90 seconds, though he was not on call, though his shift had ended 2 hours earlier, though nobody had messaged him. He simply appeared, the way people always seem to appear around this one bed, as if some invisible signal went out across the station the moment Daniel Whitfield's monitor changed its tone. For 6 minutes, the room was pure motion, no panic, no wasted words, just precision, urgent and quiet, the kind of teamwork I had never seen humans manage outside of this single room. And then, as suddenly as it began, the line on the monitor steadied. His heart found its rhythm again. The alarm fell silent. I stood in the doorway, unnoticed, and watched Grace lean over him and speak softly, the way you speak to someone you believe can still hear you, even when every scan says otherwise. "Not today," she whispered. "Not on my shift." I had seen this pattern 11 times now, over 8 months. 11 crashes. 11 recoveries that should not have been possible by any honest reading of his charts. 11 times the hospital spent resources it could not spare, staff it could not replace, hope it had no statistical right to hold on to. I could not understand it. And so, once his vitals were steady, once Grace finally exhaled and sat down for the first time in 6 minutes, I asked her the question that had been building in me for months. Why does this hospital defend him the way it does? I have read his file. I know his prognosis. I know what the resources spent on him could do elsewhere. I do not understand why an entire staff behaves as though the numbers do not exist for this one man. Grace looked at me for a long moment, and I braced myself for the kind of answer humans give when they do not wish to explain themselves. Instead, she reached over and pulled a worn folder from the drawer beside his bed, the corners soft from being opened too many times. "You weren't here for the outbreak," she said. It was not a question. I told her I had read about the Cassandra incident in the station archives, 3 years before my arrival, a pathogen that had somehow crossed the boundary between species, moving faster than anyone could contain it. I told her I knew the casualty numbers, the quarantine protocols, the difficult decisions the station had been forced to make. "Then you know we lost the automated systems," she said. "What you don't know is what happened after." She told me the story slowly, the way humans tell stories that still hurt them, even years later. The lower decks had been sealed within 11 hours of the first confirmed case. 4,000 people trapped behind reinforced doors, human and otherwise, breathing air that was actively working against them, waiting for a cure that did not exist yet and might never exist in time. The station's survival algorithm had made its recommendation within minutes: contain the decks. Let the automated purge cycle run its full course, even though the youngest and weakest patients would not survive the wait. Save the station. Accept the loss. It was the same kind of math I had run 100 times myself. The same cold, correct arithmetic that had never once failed to produce the statistically best outcome. Daniel Whitfield was not a doctor. He held no medical authorization, no command rank, nothing but a maintenance certification and access codes that should have been revoked the moment quarantine began. But he had spent 11 years learning every pipe, every filter, every recycler system on that station by hand, the kind of knowledge that never shows up on a resume because nobody ever thinks to test for it. He believed the automated purge was too slow. He believed he could reroute 3 separate filtration systems manually and cut the purge time by more than half, fast enough to save the people whose bodies could not survive the wait the algorithm had scheduled for them. Nobody authorized this. Nobody approved it. The moment he requested override access, 3 separate safety systems flagged his account and locked him out. He went in anyway. Grace's voice thinned as she told me this part, and I understood, somehow, that she was not simply repeating a story, she was reliving it. He bypassed the lockout using a manual override meant only for catastrophic hull breaches, a system so old that most of the station's engineers did not even know it still existed. He sealed himself into the lower decks with 4,000 strangers, and an atmosphere that was, by every measurement available, actively hostile to human life. He had no protective equipment beyond a basic filtration mask never designed for exposure this long. He had no support team. He had no way to call for help once the doors closed behind him, because the same lockdown that sealed the decks had cut every outgoing channel except emergency medical telemetry. For 19 hours he moved through corridors that had been abandoned by everyone with the good sense to leave, rerouting systems by hand, recalibrating filters with tools never meant for the job, working in air that was slowly, steadily working against his own lungs the entire time. He did not know if it would work. He told the recovery team afterward that he had run the numbers himself, alone, in the dark, and by his own calculation his odds of success were somewhere below 1 in 4. He did it anyway, because the alternative was watching a wall of numbers decide who lived and who did not, and he had decided he would rather fail trying than succeed by simply accepting the arithmetic. It worked. The purge cycle that should have taken 6 more hours than the youngest patients had left instead finished in time, faster than anyone believed possible, because one man refused to accept that the fastest available option was the only option that existed. 4,000 people walked out of those decks alive. Daniel Whitfield did not walk out on his own. He was found collapsed near the final access panel, the override switch still gripped in his hand, his lungs already damaged in ways that would never fully heal, his body having given far more than any safety protocol would have asked of him. He recovered, eventually, though never completely. The mining collapse 8 months ago, the one that had put him in this bed, in this room, under Grace's careful watch, had struck a body that had already spent its reserves once before, in the dark, for people he had never met and would, for the most part, never know by name. He didn't save us because someone ordered him to, Grace said, closing the folder gently. He didn't run the numbers and decide it was worth the risk. He decided the people behind those doors mattered more than the math. And then he went and made the math wrong. That's not something you repay with a discharge form. I sat with this for a long while, saying nothing, because I did not yet have words that could hold what I was feeling. Saravi do not sacrifice for individuals, we sacrifice for the collective, because our biology rewards that instinct, because a hive that protects its many survives longer than one that protects its few. I had never encountered a species that would choose, individually and repeatedly, without biological compulsion, to defy its own arithmetic for the sake of one life. I began watching more closely after that conversation, not as a nurse cataloging symptoms, but as someone trying to understand a pattern I could not explain through instinct alone. I watched Priya Nandan, the station director, personally reject a coalition audit that flagged Daniel Whitfield's continued care as an inefficient use of resources. I watched her absorb the resulting budget cuts across 3 other departments, rather than allow his case to be reopened for review. When I asked her why, expecting some justification rooted in policy or precedent, she only said that some debts were not the kind you closed with a form, and then she returned to her work as though the conversation had settled something obvious. I watched Marcus Bell, the requisitions officer, a man who had once argued with me for 6 months over the cost of a single diagnostic scanner, quietly approve an entire additional year of specialized neural care without requiring a single line of justification. When I brought him the renewal request, expecting resistance, he simply signed it and told me some things did not need a spreadsheet attached to them. I watched surgeons who had never once treated Daniel Whitfield directly volunteer their off hours to run experimental stimulation protocols, chasing incremental gains that moved his brain activity from 11% toward 12, then toward 13, numbers so small that any coalition efficiency board would call the effort a waste of specialized time. None of them called it a waste. None of them seemed to weigh the cost at all. I began to understand, slowly, that this was not policy. It was not a hospital rule, written down somewhere and quietly enforced. It was 40 separate people, unconnected by any shared directive, each arriving independently at the same conclusion, that this particular life was worth protecting beyond what any reasonable calculation would recommend. I asked Oliver Finch about it one evening, while he reviewed the latest scan results with the same careful attention he gave every scan, though the improvement it showed was smaller than the margin of measurement error. "You know this will not restore him," I said. "Even in the most optimistic projection, his recovery ceiling remains low. The Coalition Medical Standard would classify this as an unjustifiable allocation of specialized time." Oliver did not look up from the scan. "Maybe," he said, "but he didn't calculate his odds before he walked into those decks. He didn't sit down and figure out whether 19 hours of exposure was a reasonable trade for 4,000 strangers. He just decided it was worth trying. I figure the least I can do is try just as hard for him, even if the numbers say I shouldn't bother." I told him this reasoning was not efficient. He agreed, without any defensiveness at all, and told me that efficiency was not the point, and that some things were worth doing simply because they were right, regardless of whether the outcome could be guaranteed. It was a strange thing, to watch an entire medical culture organize itself around a principle that had no measurable return. My people build civilizations on optimization. We survive because we do not waste resources on causes that cannot repay their cost. And yet here was a hospital, staffed by dozens of individuals with no biological mandate to cooperate this way, choosing again and again to defend one unrecoverable patient as though his survival mattered more than the sum of everyone else his care might have helped instead. I did not understand it, not fully, not for a long time. Then, 6 months into my observation, another crisis struck the station, smaller than the Cassandra outbreak but no less dangerous. A cooling failure in the reactor support system threatened to cascade through the eastern wing, the same wing that housed both the main surgical theaters and the long-term care ward where Daniel Whitfield still lay, unmoving, unaware, his monitor humming steadily beside him. Evacuation protocols activated within minutes. Every mobile patient was cleared first, as protocol demanded, moved efficiently toward the western wing while engineering teams fought to stabilize the failing systems. Immobile patients came next, according to survival probability. The ones with the highest chance of benefiting from continued care moved before those the algorithm judged less likely to recover. Daniel Whitfield sat at the very bottom of that list. 11% brain activity, non-recoverable by coalition standards, the kind of patient any efficient triage system would leave for last, if it moved him at all. Grace refused the order the moment it came through. She did not argue with the algorithm. She simply disconnected his portable monitor, gathered the equipment keeping him stable, and began moving him herself, alone, against direct instruction, toward the evacuation route reserved for higher priority patients. I found her in the corridor, struggling with equipment meant for 2 people to carry, and for one long moment the old instinct in me rose up again, the calculation running before I could stop it. Every second spent on this one patient was a second not spent on someone the algorithm ranked higher, someone statistically more likely to survive and thrive because of the help. I ran the numbers. And then, for the first time in my life, I chose not to follow them. I stepped forward and took the other end of the equipment cart without a word. Grace looked at me, surprised, and I told her only that 4 hands would move faster than 2, which was true, though it was not the whole truth of why I had stopped. We moved him together through corridors filling slowly with warning alarms, past teams working desperately to contain the failing systems, until we reached the western wing and settled him safely among patients the algorithm had ranked far above him. Grace did not thank me, she only nodded, the way people nod when they already expected help to arrive, because in this hospital, it always had. The reactor failure was contained within the hour. No patients were lost. Daniel Whitfield's vitals never wavered during the entire evacuation, steady and stubborn, the same way they had been steady and stubborn through 11 crashes over 8 months, as though something in him refused to be reduced to a statistic even while unconscious. Afterward, sitting alone in the staff lounge, I found myself running the numbers one final time, out of old habit rather than genuine doubt. Resources spent, hours lost, risk accepted, all weighed against the return of a single life with no meaningful prognosis of recovery. By every standard my species had ever built, the equation still came back the same way it always had. And for the first time I understood that the equation was not the point, and had never been the point. Not for this hospital, not for this staff, not for the man who had once walked alone into a sealed corridor, because he refused to let numbers decide who deserved to live. Grace found me there later, and I told her what I had realized as plainly as I could manage. I told her that my people did not have a category for value that existed outside of exchange, that we did not have a word for a debt that was never meant to be repaid, because our survival had always depended on counting everything precisely enough that nothing was ever given away for free. She smiled, tired but genuine, and told me that humans did not always have a word for it either. Sometimes, she said, you just decide someone matters, and you keep deciding it, every single day, whether or not there is a reason attached to the decision at all. I check on Daniel Whitfield every shift now, the same as I always have, though something in the habit has changed since that conversation. I no longer read his chart looking for justification. I no longer run the silent calculation that once lived behind every visit, weighing his continued care against everyone else it might have served instead. I simply sit with him for a few minutes, the way Grace does, the way Oliver does, the way this entire hospital has quietly chosen to do for 8 months and counting, and I tell him, though I do not know if he can hear me, that the corridor he walked into alone all those years ago is still open, still being kept clear, still waiting for the day he finally walks back out of it. My people count everything. I have learned, slowly and completely, that this station has built its entire heart around knowing exactly what should never be counted at all.